Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
It's Ron Crabtree back with another episode of MetaPod, where we focus in on the three common challenges that anybody involved with tangible goods is facing is forever labor shortage, digital transformation, digitization of work, and of course, needing to do more with less, less labor, resources, facilities, less tariffs and problems associated with that. And I've got Greg Smith that's going to introduce himself here in a moment, but we're going to talk here more about the ongoing, I'll call it the tariff catastrophe, and how that impacts anybody involved with importing and exporting goods to other countries, because you've got all these retaliatory tariffs going on, et cetera. And Greg happens to be a deep expert in the life sciences space. He's going to be talking about, the tariff risk readiness, what's your 90-day mandate in the life sciences supply chain. But my guess is no matter what industry you're in, you're sharing the same kinds of challenges, and a lot of this advice would be very applicable no matter what industry you're in. Albeit, Greg's going to share some interesting insights unique to the life sciences supply chain. So with that, this is really a great, podcast for you if you're associated with execution of a global supply chain of any kind. And just a reminder, if you like this podcast, be sure to like it, be sure to follow it, be sure to share it with others. We appreciate that too. So with that, Greg, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, Ron, first, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with you. So I guess my introduction to myself is I've been in the supply chain space for 25 years. I started in this industry before it was hip and cool. Most of the time when I started in supply chain, it was Charlie in the back room with a clipboard and a cigar saying, I want that truck going over here. And so we progressed a long way since then. But I think that progression has also created its own problems. So I've spent time in senior roles at Deloitte & Touche. I spent time at a company called Metagroup, which was acquired by Gartner Consulting. I spent time as a senior exec at IBM, and now have my own practice. And I specialize in supply chain. But we also look at the holistic issue related to supply chain, not just individual problems, but holistically. And I think to your point earlier, what we're seeing is there are endemic problems within supply chains. We've been more reactive versus proactive in our supply chains, and they've become a lot more complicated, but not a lot more sophisticated or positive in their influence. So the last thing I'd say on that, Ron, is supply chain is now a topical conversation at the board level. And everybody's looking at supply chain either to take out costs, to improve efficiencies, or to just make the overall operating environment more efficient. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, sir.
All right. Well, in that case, that was really good. And what we'd like to do next is kind of get into three areas that you would argue that you really should be diagnosing, investigating, taking a deep dive and looking at three key areas: life sciences or any other industry. And you might even comment here about what's unique about life sciences with respect to the tariff catastrophe that's going on. And just help, our audience that may not know a lot about supply chain or life sciences to understand, hey, if I'm going to walk down the hall and try to assess the nature of the gaps, threats, or opportunities with respect to these diagnostics, help our audience understand what they're looking for, why they're looking for it, how to get the data and information and measure and gauge the degree of opportunity or threat. So I'll just turn that over to you from there.
Well, let me start with the area of expertise that I've been focusing on for the last, 10 years, which is the life sciences, which includes medical device, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology. And as far as the tariffs go, we've seen there's a lot of fluidity in the tariff discussion. A lot of companies are questioning what to do, but there's a lot of countries that are coming back to the current administration and saying, hey, we're willing to negotiate. And so there's a lot of fluidity to that. The one area there's not a lot of fluidity is in the life sciences space. And recently the Labor Secretary, U.S. Labor Secretary Letnick, came back and said, look, pharmaceuticals are an imperative to our country's going forward position. We cannot afford to have the product that we're so heavily dependent on foreign countries, to wit, India, and China importing all of our pharmaceuticals, life sciences, and that includes the raw goods, that includes packaged goods and finished goods. This is an imperative to our country going forward. So we don't see as much wiggle room on the tariffs for supply chain, for life sciences, as we do in other aspects of the tariff battle, as you call it.
Or catastrophe, exactly.
Catastrophe.
All right, cool. So take us into some diagnostics here, of kind of any organization, particularly in life sciences. What are three things they should really be looking hard at to determine the threat, the opportunity, or the mandate to do something?
So let me break it down in the three topics that you discussed. Let's go data, data, data. What we found is when I go in and look at a lot of organizational structures, they've kind of grown by, there really hasn't been a lot of proactiveness to the growth of the supply chain. It's been more reactive, whether it be through acquisition or just internal growth. But what we find is a disparity in data, in the availability to data. So you may have multiple operating systems within your organization. So whether it's a transportation management system, a warehouse management system, sales and operations planning, an ERP system, all of these systems are working, but they're not working cohesively. So the data isn't flowing in seamlessly. So for somebody to sit down and make a quantitative decision, it's hard to do. And I think what we're seeing is with tariffs, that's focusing this point very strongly. It doesn't give senior management the decision-making power to say, how are we going to affect change? What are our options? So that said, one of the things that we find very much within most supply chains is this: data is everywhere. So you may be using it for production planning, but production planning doesn't talk to transportation, doesn't talk to sales and operations planning. So you've got all this data, but it's disparate, and it's causing a lot of dysfunction within organizations.
Can you share a story of maybe where you dug into that with somebody and what they learned? I mean, something specific that the audience can relate to.
So I recently did an engagement with a large Fortune 50 pharmaceutical company where they thought they had their procurement department pretty much squared away. And when we sat and had a first call with them, they said, "Oh, no, everything's squared away. We just need to tweak it a little bit to make it a little bit more functional." Well, I'm an old-fashioned guy, so I said, "Well, let's go out and take a look at the operations." And they said, "Well, that's okay. We can do this virtually, but let me explain. We've got this system that does this, and this system does that." And I said, "Fine, let me just go out to the facility and take a look." So we did, and we walked the facility. And as much as senior management thought that they had different operating systems, and when I say operating systems, supply chain software systems, what we found out is on the floor level and at the operating level, everybody was using Excel spreadsheets. And they were using the Excel spreadsheets and dumping that information into the operating system because that's what they were mandated to do. As we all know, Excel spreadsheets really, aren't as the most efficient process. So what we did is we went in and took a look at that data, and we actually brought in artificial intelligence. And we brought in artificial intelligence to bridge the gap between the different operating systems and put a cohesive data element together so that we could actually start making proactive decisions. Then the tariffs hit, or the discussions around the tariffs hit. Now, all of a sudden, this organization had the ability for a centralized repository of data to start making decisions. Do we insource? Do we outsource? Do we use contract manufacturers? What's the tie-up going to be with raw goods? What's our dependency on this? How much should we have in our supply? What is our production plan going to be? From a procurement perspective, how do we offset some of the risks that we have there? And again, we kind of bypassed the Excel spreadsheets and started using the systems that were in place more proactively. And I think that's pervasive. I've seen a lot of that. As much as everybody hates to admit it, Excel spreadsheet is still the dominant supply chain technology. It's out there.
All right. So if I'm understanding this diagnostic, we have to actually go to the point of attack where we're executing on the materials management system, if you will, the supply
Mhm.
management system, and just do a careful look at, is this integrated? Is the data seamlessly flowing where it's needed for decision support or not? And if you're finding spreadsheets, that would be a clear signal that there's a gap for sure, because people are being forced to manually manipulate data with a frozen data set typically, because I've been through that many, many times myself,
Right.
in industry is, okay, well, we take a snapshot of the data, we drag it into Excel, we make all these decisions, then we push it back. And that's a very manual, laborious process, highly dependent on individual subject matter experts who know how to do the magic. And then, but it's dated, it's subject to human error,
Mhm.
it's not interactive, and it's not going to respond quickly. That's a cycle you have to go through versus, is the data actually available, present, and immediately, I mean, instantly accessible for decision support? That's what you're assessing.
And I would add to that, one of the problems, it's not just at the operating software level, but it's also each one of the functions within supply chain often has a different mandate. So procurement has its own set of rules and regulations and how they're measured. Transportation, logistics has a different set, production has a different set. So there's not always a lot of cohesive room to play nicely. So everybody's kind of playing in their own sandbox and there's not this need to integrate. So this is where senior management needs to step in and say, no, this is what we're going to do. We need to
Cool.
get a cohesive data set going.
All right. Awesome. Let's keep going here. I think I want to talk more about this reengineering thing you mentioned, and you've got some data here and some examples you were going to share. I'm anxious to hear more about that.
Well, I think the reengineering and since COVID,
Or at least we're evaluating the need to re-engineer. Let's just say that.
so let me take it from that perspective. Since COVID, and I think COVID really diagnosed that our supply chains are weak and that they're very vulnerable and they're not operating cohesively. Unfortunately, when COVID kind of wrapped up, we went back to the standard processes that we were using before. So it was more, as I said earlier, uh, reactive versus proactive. Now we've got the tariffs, which is again throwing us into the same issue. We're not able to make informed decisions. So I think people are starting to say, you know what, enough of this. Our supply chains are not operating cohesively. They're not operating to their full extent. We need to change that. And again, I hate to use the term again, but I'm going to go back to data. It's about data. And the fact that you haven't got this standardized data process throughout the systems. And again, I also ask, and one of the things I find interesting when I talk to senior management, they'll tell me, wait a minute, we just spent $30 million implementing an ERP system, and we just upgraded it. You're telling me I got to bring in another system? Or you can, we just bought a TMS, transportation management system. You're telling me I got to go buy another one? No, I'm not going to do that because the shareholders aren't going to put up with it. Again, you go back to them and saying, that's fine. I understand your issue. The systems are fine. It's just that they don't talk to each other. So we need to build those data layers so that everything talks to each other.
Yeah, cool. So is there another area of diagnostic you want to get into?
Well, I think it's being proactive. I've said this before, but how can we start looking at risk? Clearly one of the risks that we're dealing with right now is in the pharmaceutical life sciences space. What happens if that international trade gets shut off? What if we can't import our raw goods for pharmaceuticals or our components for a life sciences product or a medical device product? What are we going to do? How many vendors do we need to have? Are our vendors operating correctly in the procurement space? The other question is using contract manufacturers, which is pretty much the default that everybody's been going to right now.
Mm.
Oh, we'll just use a contract manufacturer either here or in Mexico. Well, there's limited capacity within the contract manufacturers. They can't produce all of this. They can't all of a sudden shift everything from China to the U.S. That's going to be a longer term play. So again, then you need to get the risk assessment on how much can we use contract manufacturers? How much are we going to need to use the current operating process? How do we shift that? What's the short-term, medium-term, long-term to using contract manufacturer or bringing the manufacturing back to the United States? This doesn't just happen. You don't just flip a switch and build a $20 million manufacturing facility with cold chain responsibilities and clean rooms here in the United States. It takes years. So that risk, that you have to make those risk assessments. And again, I'm going to be redundant here, but it comes down to data. You can't make an informed risk decision if you haven't got all the right data input to make those decisions.
Yeah, that's really important. My friend Jeff Burris with Advanced Purchasing Dynamics, he said something that kind of stuck with me. He says, if you're looking at, resourcing, nearshoring, onshoring with different suppliers, so be careful you don't love your suppliers to death, meaning overloading them to the point where they can't supply you quality or on time or at volume. So that's part of the risk you've got to assess when you need the data to understand the true capacity of a given supplier or a set of suppliers. You've got to have a basis of making, an informed decision so you don't end up killing your suppliers or worse, shutting your own business down because now you have no supply.
I completely concur with that. And again, I've just recently wrapped up an engagement where we found in the procurement department that procurement was driving the decision-making process for who the vendors were. And production was saying, wait a minute, these current vendors, 60% of the time the product they're shipping us doesn't meet our quality standards. Right. So therefore, our production is being shut down, and procurement is saying, but wait a minute, we've got contracts with these folks. We have to use them as a vendor. And procurement on the other side is staying, putting their foot in the ground on this, but production saying, wait a minute, I can't have this. So again, it goes back to what we were saying, that the disparity amongst the different operating units. And that's where senior management has to make an assessment and kind of tell everybody to play nice in the sandbox.
Yeah, coming up with that collaboration can be a little tricky when you've got competing priorities. Just reminds me of a true story. I was working for an automotive supplier in materials management, and there's this big bag. We're making interior trim, right? This is automotive interior trim. They go in these big racks. And the last step was put this big plastic bag over all that, right? To keep the dust and dirt off it as it was shipped and into the warehouse, onto a truck, and then ultimately to the assembly plant. And then I was looking for cost outs, right? So I found a bag that I could save, probably a nickel, almost 10 cents a bag. But what the supplier did is they basically made the bag a little smaller and a little lighter gauge. So what's happening is the guys in manufacturing were out there struggling to get these bags onto these racks. They're tugging and pulling and ripping the bags, and they're going crazy out there. And I'll never forget the look on the general manager in manufacturing. I went off that. I said, but Mike, I'm saving 10 cents a bag. And he just looked at me like, I want to punch you.
Right.
Because we were wasting, dollars with just people struggling and fighting with these dumb things.
Well, it kind of goes, it's an excellent perspective, but again, I go back to the life sciences space. The bag that you talked about, if you translate that to life sciences and you're using an incorrect product or a product not up to speed, you're talking recalls. Then I'm talking product denigration. You're talking about lawsuits. But so again, to your analogy, if not everybody's playing in the sandbox together, then we've got a serious problem. And again, that's where legal gets involved or insurance gets involved to do a risk assessment. And again, I'm being redundant here, but it's all dependent on data. And typically what I find at the board level, when you're using data, people don't tend to argue because it's hard facts. It's not like, well, we'd like to change our production plan. We'd like to make our operating systems more efficient. We'd like to get procurement a little bit more efficient. But when you sit down and you actually put data in front of them and say, no, wait a minute, your production planning is 60% behind because you're using Excel spreadsheets. That's not a nice to have, that's data driven. So that's one of the bigger issues that I'm seeing a lot of organizations move to. The buzzword now is digitalization of your supply chain. What does that mean? It means common data throughout the process.
Totally.
If I'm evangelizing, I apologize.
No, that's okay. So some other things I saw in the notes here, we talked about regulatory readiness, systems integration, process flow, execution readiness. Let's dig into a different diagnostic. What else should we be looking hard at to assess the nature of the risk and opportunity?
Well, I think we have to look at where we want to be. What's next? Mergers and acquisitions. How is that going to affect our operating environment? And again, in this highly regulated industry that we're in right now, I'm seeing a lot of clients are starting to make decisions about potential acquisitions of manufacturing facilities here in the States. So instead of using a contract manufacturer or being dependent on their current production, they're saying, wait a minute, part of our strategic outlook here is maybe to acquire existing manufacturing organizations. But again, that requires integrating systems, people, process, and technologies. But again, that's an option that's being looked at not only the executive level, but at the board level as well.
Makes sense. Okay, cool. So before we move into what to go do, right, when you're running into these sorts of challenges, anything else that you would offer is something that we should be looking at and examining for the nature of the risk, threat, or the opportunity before we get into how do you go fix those problems?
Well, I think to answer that question is back to tariffs. It's again just another factor that is saying our supply chains are not operating at full capacity, or they're not operating in a cohesive fashion. How many times do we have to be told? We had COVID, now we've got tariffs. We're not proactive, we're reactive. And that's what we've got to change our supply chain. So I think it's not a nice to have anymore, it's a need to have. And again, I started this conversation saying I started this industry when Charlie in the back room was a supply chain guy with a cigar and a clipboard. But we've gotten past that, and it's now at the executive level and at the board level. You're hearing supply chain. And again, I'm not talking about theory here. I'm talking about execution. A lot of folks spent a lot of money on some of the more elite consulting firms who built pretty PowerPoint presentations, but they weren't actionable. So we need to take action now.
Okay. Well, let's move in then to, what do we do, right? What's the practical sage advice that you would offer that, we thought about this. Yes, in fact, we do have those things as challenges. What's the approach to go tackle those and knock those down?
I think the first thing is to do a kind of a blueprint of what your current as-is operating environment is.
Okay.
Is your transportation management system talking to your warehouse management system, and map that out? So again, not to make it theoretical saying, well, they should. No, actually get in and show that they're not operating cohesively. Production planning isn't talking to procurement.
Yeah, you said something really important there, Greg. So I'd like you to expand on that. So I'm going to go do the mapping now. What am I mapping? Exactly what data information? What do I want to get as the product, right? Because we talk about mapping that we bring 100 experts in the room and put mapping on the wall and they have 100 definitions of what you meant by that. So maybe with some specificity here, when you're doing the mapping, there's exactly the kinds of information you need to understand and be able to measure, right, and quantify to get to a solid baseline to understand what your current state is. Can you give it, a little specificity there?
I just recently wrapped up an engagement that speaks specifically to this. One of the things that we started to look at was how sales and operations planning was interacting with production planning and how production planning was working with procurement. And again, this seems like a natural flow that the sales team is communicating to the production team, is communicating with the procurement team, and then downstream to the logistics team. When we got in and started mapping this and started having conversations, we found out that wasn't happening. So sales wasn't having a conversation with production. In fact, most of the sales and operation planning meetings that I sat in on were almost like roundtable fights. It was like a brawl. Sales was saying one thing, production was saying something else. There was no conversation. And everybody had different priorities, as we said earlier. So that's the kind of mapping I'm talking about. If sales comes in with a projection that says we think we're going to produce X number of products this quarter, how does that flow to production planning? How does that downstream flow to procurement? So that all of these processes are being thought of ahead of time versus, sales just sold something. We got to map up. We got to ramp up production. Hey, by the way, guys, we haven't got enough inventory on hand, so therefore we have to create more. Oh, by the way, production, you've got to talk to procurement. Procurement, you got to talk, again, instead of pointing the finger, having a cohesive unit that operates together.
Okay, very good.
And again, that sounds simple, but it's not. As you and I
The
both
devil
know.
is in the details. So, and imagining that, you take a transaction, here's product ABC, here's demand for X number of units with this packaging configuration and requirements, and actually physically tracking that through its process of who's touching it at what point and how that information is flowing and being used, which systems are involved, who's doing what, but actually having a visualization of that. And then along the way, identifying where are the disconnects, where are the blind spots, where are the points where, it doesn't happen as intended. I mean, is that the granularity you would suggest?
Absolutely. When the sales team is, let's be blunt, when the sales team is out making a call and their client says, we're going to need 50 of these widgets next quarter. How does that information flow back into the system? Does it flow through so the production knows to ramp up or maybe create a third shift versus a second shift on the production line? How does procurement know that they have enough inventory on hand, raw goods to produce? That's the flow of information that we'd want to see. And that's where
You're not really living that life cycle of exactly how that actually happens in the real world, not what's on paper, not what, the software maps say, but what physically actually happens if you take that transaction. In other words, that demand and then translating all the way down through manufacturing execution and logistics, how does that information actually get handled? Who does what and when? And what's the feedback loop, right? If you can't do it, how does that actually work?
Well, and again, I go back to the discussion that somebody's got to be the king of the sandbox and somebody's got to be overseeing each one of these departments saying, guys, sales, I appreciate what you're saying, but your accuracy, the last 3 quarters where you were projecting X number of widgets to be sold and we sold half of that. Therefore, production was overextended. We ordered too much inventory or we ordered too much raw goods. Again, let's get everything a little bit more systematic. Or maybe the inverse. Maybe sales is not, maybe they're underestimating their sales. And therefore, production, and as you and I both know, to start a production line or run a third shift, you don't just snap your fingers and make that happen. And again, I'm going to be really redundant here, but it's about data.
No, I agree with that. One of the things you said that kind of caught my ear is makes me think about the value stream owner. And conceptually, you think about the pillars of the functions, right? As you work your way across the value stream of producing it. And then, there's a functional responsibility for all that data management. But the value stream owner actually sits out here, if you will, to the left. They have the view of the customer, the clear view of the customer, market demands. Right. But they're looking across all the functions, and they have ownership and accountability to connect the functions with who's doing what with this data and information through the entire life cycle out through shipping and fulfillment. And kind of being the advocate to create the glue. Have you used that as a technique in the past to try to break down some of those barriers?
I have. And one of the transitions that I've seen is as supply chain has become a lot more acceptable is we're seeing board level supply chain management, senior vice president supply chain, who can be that conductor, who has that influence, can sit with the CFO and say, wait a minute, or sit with the head of the chief operating officer and say, wait a minute, we've got a breakdown here. You need to have that board level or at least executive level presence to kind of mediate and say, look, here are the processes, here are the problems that we're running into. So that's one of the major changes that I've seen recently is, again, we're going from an executional system to somebody who's sitting a little higher up who has that grand view of the entire system.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Anything else on your short list of things you should go do to knock down these challenges?
I think it's risk. I think we have to start doing a risk perspective. We can't be so dependent on our software programs to do what they're supposed to do, because as you and I both know, the old adage, giga, garbage in, garbage out. Because you're not supplying the right data to your operating system, you're not going to get the output that you need. So I think we need to break down those barriers. We have to take this as a warning. This is not something, supply chain is very disruptible. It's very fragile, and we have to start thinking 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years out versus 6 hours or 60 days. I think we have to be more process driven and pragmatic in that we can't operate on an hourly basis. We have to operate on a yearly basis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it does. And one of the things I've been trying to make leaders think about when we think about supply chain is it's quite easy to say, okay, well, supply chain is about getting the goods from the supplier and doing the conversion and shipping it and getting it fulfilled. The physical movement of the goods, that's what's in your mind. But
Right.
I've argued for a long time, and you might agree with this or disagree, that probably 85% of supply chain management is managing the information required
It is.
to execute on a timely basis and being able to synchronously combine or, communicate demand signal changes, supply signal changes, and then consumption changes, actual consumption, and being able to iterate that quickly and easily. That's 85% of the supply chain management challenge. It's not the physical movement of the goods.
I completely concur with what you're saying. And to compound that, we also haven't spoken about IT. So all of a sudden, IT is involved here. And IT has a different perspective on how things should be operating. We have to integrate that in. But again, this goes back to the discussion we were having. You need to have that senior person in supply chain who can mediate all of that and look at all the different players and bring them into a central sandbox to play nicely.
Yeah, I love it. That agrees with what I've been experiencing, and so that's really great advice. Anything else from a go-do advice perspective you might offer?
I think you have to do it now. We can't think about this. We can't postulate anymore. The tariffs, specifically in the life sciences space, this is not a 6-month, 8-month, 20-month process. In effect, the U.S. government has said you've got 90 days on a tariff-wide basis, or we're going to start affecting change. That's a mandate. And that's not something people should be sitting back and saying, okay, we'll wait till the 90 days is over. No, you need to look at your supply chain now, assess the risk, and understand how you're going to change. On the life sciences, medical device, pharmaceutical side, I think that 90 days is more than a priority. You got to get to it now. Now, you're not going to be able to swallow the whole enchilada at one time. You're going to have to affect change, but you need to put the process in place now.
Yeah. Yeah, pick something that is particularly high risk and cycle that very,
Right.
very quickly so the organization can learn, it can demonstrate success and failure at the better integration of the data and better decision-making support so that at least for something important, you can get that done right away and then learn and then scale that from there.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
All right. Well, Craig, this has been awesome. You've brought some insights here that I hadn't really thought about. There are some unique challenges in the life sciences space, but I would say these cascade to almost industries as a practical matter. These are industry, agnostic kinds of problems. And the more complex your product in terms of capital goods and things like that, the gnarlier it gets because of the complexity and the size of the supply chain. So if folks want to get in touch with you, pick your brain a little bit, learn more about, what we talked about today, how do they do that?
Well, I have my own webpage. It's relatively simple, jgsmith.com. You can reach me via email, which is gsmith@jgsmith.com, or the best way is probably just via the old cell phone, 202-255-1440. And again, I enjoy this. I think we're at a crossroads now. I think we're getting past spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations to actually having to execute. I like to think that I'm on that mode of getting on the boots on the ground and actually diagnosing and fixing problems. So that's my sales pitch, Ron.
Awesome. Good job. Thanks for joining me, Greg.
Pleasure. Believe me.
Awesome. So thank you, everybody. We're going to wrap up there. Remember, we appreciate it if you can, like the podcast, follow it, and even better, refer it to others and suggest maybe they could get some benefit from learning about what thought leaders like Greg bring to the party. So thanks for joining me, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.